I have to start by making some sort of declarations of interest, which is to say that I'm currently a member of council of the RIBA, and I guess you know what that is, and I'm also a planning inspector, a part-time planning inspector. So the opinions that I give you are my opinions, not necessarily the government's or the planning inspectorate's opinions or the RIBA's opinions, except if I say it is. The other thing that I perhaps should do is just tell you that I'm an architect and town planner. I've been working as both for a long time, and I've been very involved in the RIBA in particular for a long time. That includes dealing with things like the Code of Conduct. I recently chaired the review of the RIBA Code of Conduct. I've been involved with adjudications. I'm involved with the professional indemnity insurance, the group that looks after that. And so what this lecture does, as I guess all lectures do, is they cross the boundaries. Things that I will be talking about this afternoon will also have an effect on a question about professional indemnity insurance or something like that. And just in that context, I'm also at the moment advising a number of architects who've had complaints laid against them. And let me tell you that even if you're successful in having the complaint struck out, the stress and the cost involved is very high, so you don't want to go there. And finally, I should also say that I sometimes examine on the Part 3 course. So that what I'm going to talk about is what you need to know in day-to-day, in your working lives, but also, I hope, a few tips about the sort of questions that examiners like to put to their victims and their candidates. I think there are a few very obvious questions that start with examiner asking you a straightforward question and then asking you to expand, and I'll come across a couple of those as we go along. You should have two sets of printed notes. One is a sort of crib sheet, which I work to take you through the session, but which has spelled out and checked the title of various bits of legislation and the title of various bits of policy and so on. So you don't need to try hurriedly to scribble them down from the screen because they're set out for you. And the other one, the one that's entitled References, is a series of extracts really from, in some cases, legislation, in some cases, policy documents. And again, they're given in full, or they're given more fully than what's on the screen, and they're given, I hope, quite carefully, which means that you don't need to copy them down from the screen. The one thing I would always say, though, is that whenever you're asked a question about the planning system, go back and read the original policy or the original bit of legislation or whatever it is. Don't rely on your memory. I don't do that. It's just too dangerous. You're too likely to go wrong. What I'm going to tell you about this afternoon then, the first session is about the plan-led system. The system that we have is called a planning system supposedly because we follow a series of plans prepared by local authorities, by councils, generally speaking. Then I'm going to talk about the need for planning permission, when you need planning permission and when you don't. And there are some increasingly complicated rules about that, when you don't need to apply for planning permission so that you can carry on, except that you need to do that in a rather specific way so it doesn't make a huge difference. Then I'm going to talk about planning applications, which I think is the key area for architects. I also sometimes advise, well, I've been advising for a long time, probably 25 years, members of the RIBA who ring up. If you ring up, there's a helpline for RIBA members. And if you ring up with a contract query, you get a solicitor who knows about contracts. If you ring up with a planning query, there are, I think, 2 or 3 of us. Anne Williams, who's a barrister, is one. There's a chap who's a planning lawyer who's one, and I'm one. And architects do quite often ring up about a problem with a planning application where they've tripped over perhaps a certificate or a site plan or something like that. Then I'm going to talk about planning appeals. That's a very good question to put in the part 3 because there are some straightforward answers and then scope for discussion. The historic environment, listed buildings and conservation areas essentially, but not exclusively. Are lots of you planning to be conservation architects? Nobody wants a few, yes. Sometimes there are lots of people who want to be conservation architects, but usually it's a handful. What I want to emphasize, though, is that all of you need to know about listed buildings and conservation areas. One of the cases that I'm dealing with at the moment is an architect who took in his defense to the ARB this morning, and one of the criticisms made is that he was working on a listed building when he's not a conservation architect. He's an ordinary, if you like, architect. And I think that's entirely reasonable, that all architects ought to know enough to work on most listed buildings, but we'll talk about that a bit later. And finally, I want to talk about lawfulness and enforcement notices, and presumably, have you come across enforcement? What happens when the council says you've built this building without planning permission, you've now got to knock it down, and how you explain that to the ARB and the RIBA and your professional indemnity insurers and so on. Have any of you got experience of that? Nobody at all. That's good, and good luck, long may it be so. But often you will have issues, sometimes spurious claims raised, and sometimes people come along to you and say, well, I've got this planning permission, and I thought it would be all right if I built it a bit bigger. I had a case in Spain where the English client came to me because his builder had convinced him that the sensible thing to do was to add an extra floor to the house. And the council took exception to that. We sorted it out in the end, but it was not straightforward. So we start with, well, you've got the title page, and then we start with the plan-led system. And what I really want to emphasize is section 38, bracket 6 of the 2004 Act. You need to recite this to yourself going to sleep at night so that you absolutely memorize it. You can absolutely trot it out to the examiners. That when a determination is, oh, I have to start now. Well, does everybody speak English as their first language? Most of you do. In some of the places that I give this talk, it's only about half the lecture, half the audience. But in any case, there are some words here that are not everyday English. Development has a very particular meaning in planning law, and it's in the appendices, and we'll come to it about halfway through the afternoon. Determination in this context means to decide. And material, and you often come across material change to the appearance or material considerations. It means something like significant or important. So what this is saying is that if the local planning authority or an appeal of planning inspector has to have regard, has to think about the development plan, that's more than just having regard to it. It means that the decision has got to follow the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Learn to recite that. Unless there's some good reason not to follow the development plan. So it might be that the development plan says we've built enough houses in our area, but everybody knows, because the demographics surveys and the estate agents' prices and so on tell you that there aren't enough houses, even if the development plan says that no more houses need to be built, it might be that the important consideration that we do need to build more houses, it might be that that outweighs the development plan. But the point is you start with the development plan. That's the beginning of the issue. And then you have to think about other considerations, including other plans. And one of those might be the new development plan that's nearly ready but not quite finished. But that is a material consideration. That carries weight. And sometimes you get into very complicated arguments about how much weight is to be given to one policy or another policy. Do you all know about well, it's a medieval, are you all medieval historians? Not all of you. There's a concept in philosophical circles about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And the question, of course, is about whether angels have size, have substance, how big they are, and so on. And so you had endless religious conferences about the nature of angels. Planning conferences are a bit like that when it comes to weighing the weight to be given to one particular policy or another policy. The development plan is absolute. The trouble is that the development plan gets out of date, new policies start to emerge, and you have to start weighing different policies against each other. You also have, we're going to come to in a moment, informal policies and supplementary guidance. You have some designations like sites of special scientific interest, like areas of outstanding natural beauty, which are sort of outside the planning system, but they're really not, and which you have to give great weight to. And we're going to talk about listed buildings and conservation areas, which are actually quite separate, but again, feed into the planning system. So when you start to look at policies, you have a policy hierarchy. And I've put, and some people will tell me I'm wrong, I put the national planning policies at the top. The National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, and I think you are allowed to say NPPF. In principle, I would advise you never to use acronyms for examiners, because examiners hate it. Because you know that ABL is Acme Builders Limited, but the examiner doesn't know that, and it's very irritating to go backwards and forwards. But the National Planning Policy Framework is now so important in the system that you ought to know about it, and you ought actually to download it and print it, and at least read the bits that interest you. Read the bit on green belts, the bit on design, the bit on historic buildings. And there's something called the Planning Practice Guidance. The National Planning Policy Framework was invented in 2012 and was reviewed last year, and reviewed again because they missed a couple of bits in February of this year. So make sure you've downloaded and learned the latest one. It's about 70 pages, I think. And it gives you key policy approaches to things. And the government of the day boasted about how it had reduced the planning system to only 70-odd pages. Underpinning it is something called the Planning Practice Guidance, which is so bulky that it's not printed at all. I think it must run to some couple of thousand pages. And that's on the planning portal. You can easily Google the planning portal. Incidentally, I've given you in the papers the actual web addresses for the planning inspectorate and the planning portal and so on. But you know as well as I do that if you type in planning portal, by the time you've got to the second N in planning, it's come up anyway. So it's easy to find, and it's easy to look for their topic areas. The only thing I would just give a bit of a warning about is to read through the whole contents page. I don't know whether any of you are still fans of Harry Potter, but they did exams called wizard levels, and the planning practice guidance is a bit like that, because if you want to look up listed buildings or historic environment, you look under C for conserving and enhancing the historic environment. And if you want to look up conditions or planning conditions, you look under U for the use of planning conditions. And an application or a planning application, you look under M for making a planning application. I find that not very easy and not very intuitive. So when you're looking for something, scroll through the whole of the menu that you're being offered to find the thing that you want. But those are very useful. I think they're written for both the professional and the lay, the next door neighbour who wants to know whether they can object to a planning application. But they're reasonably concise and they're reasonably clear. The next layer down is the regional planning policies. The only regional policy that really still survives is the London Plan. The other regions were abolished, of course, and the London Plan now forms part of the Development Plan. and so do the local plans, which I'm going to turn to in just a moment, the local planning policies. Below that, so be warned, are things called supplementary planning documents, which are only guidance. There are a few authorities in West London who refer to them as the rules, the design rules for building house extensions or for building a new house or building a new housing development. But they're not rules, they're guidance, and if you can produce an architectural reason for changing the rules or for breaking the rules, then you can do that. Some years ago I acted for an architect right in the centre of London, in Camden, but it was only just north of Oxford Circus, I think northeast of Oxford Circus. And it was a 19th century building, which had been converted into flats many years ago. And what they wanted to do, and what the architect wanted to do, was to build a penthouse flat. And the rule book, the design guidance, of course, said you can build an attic story, but it's got to have a roof pitch of 70 degrees, it's got to be a fake mansard, it's got to be clad in lead, and or else in slates. And what the architect wanted to do, because he'd been to the AA, of course, he wanted glass and steel as the roof, not at all in accordance with the guidance. And on appeal, we won. We won because of the quality of the design and because the guidance said that that's the easy way out, if you like, but in this particular case, it was a good design and it fitted the existing building and the surroundings, and a very modern extension was allowed to the old building. It wasn't a listed building, but it was a 19th century building. Now I have to tell you about at least two different systems for the development plan, because in 2004, the then government changed the development plan system. The old system, which had been introduced in 1971, was a system basically of what were called structure plans and local plans. And those are reflected in London in the unitary development plans. And in some other parts of the country, the Isle of Wight had a unitary development plan, and Bristol Avon had a unitary development plan. But you still come across the unitary development plan in London, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But this was the Surrey structure plan, and that's all of Surrey, and it's about, in real life, it's about an A4 page, so that you can see that the whole of Surrey is on an A4 page. It's very diagrammatic. You can see where the motorways are. You can see the growth points at Guildford and just north of Gatwick Airport at Redhill and Reigate. Over to the east, you can see a district called Tandridge, which is based on Oxted. Does anybody live in Oxted? Well, in that case, I can say something about Oxted, because Oxted thinks that it's wonderful, and it's finished. And therefore, when you ask a question about what can I have planning permission for in Oxted, the answer is pretty much nothing. And you find, whereas you find that elsewhere in the county there are things, and you do come across that in various places. But it means that one of the functions of the structure plan was to allocate development to different parts of the district. And I doubt if you can read that at the back, can you? I'm afraid not. It's because the original is printed in a very elegant shade of lilac, which makes it nearly impossible to read on the page in front of you, let alone on the screen. But what it's giving you is a list of the districts and the number of houses to be allocated, so that Oxted and Tandridge were simply told this is how many houses you would be building, whereas then more would be built in Reigate and so on. The trouble with that was that when the system, as the system evolved, and more houses need to be found, you had to really debate with the different levels of councils where the houses would be allocated. And so if you went to Tandridge, they'd say, yes, we're quite convinced, and this happened to me, we're quite convinced that houses need to be built, but actually Reigate would be a really good place to build the houses. So you went up a level to Surrey County Council, and you said, well, what about houses in Surrey? And they said, well, we think houses are really necessary. And actually, Kent would be a really good place to build houses on the Thames corridor. And because we were proposing to build something around Redhill Aerodrome, we went up to the next level still, which at the time was the regional level. And they said, yes, of course, houses need to be built, but not in the southeast of England. And they actually thought Liverpool was the right place to build houses. And that illustrates the whole problem of the planning system of how do you get people to agree, and why what we have now is a system which encourages councils, which requires councils to negotiate with their neighbours, so that, for example, central Bedfordshire, which is just north of Luton, or mostly just north of Luton, has to negotiate with Luton about where to accommodate Luton's overspill. So the next level down below the structure plan was the local plan, and this is St Albans city and district, and this is actually Harpenden, which is another small town, much like Oxted in some ways, to the north of St Albans and to the north of London. And here you can see that it's based on a 1 to 10,000 map, so you can advise your client, and current plans are very like this, but they're not on the whole printed, they're on the council's website. But you can see, is your site allocated for housing? The red patches there are allocated for housing. You can see the town centre area, and on the town centre inset, there's also a conservation area plan. And then similarly, that's reflected in the unitary development plans, which had part 1, and part 1 of a unitary development plan would be equivalent to the structure plan, whereas part 2 would be much more like a local plan. And this happens to be Southwark, and the sort of the blank bit right at the very top of the page is the River Thames. This comes up to the top of the borough, and the purple are employment areas, but you can see sort of jagged lines across, which actually are about policies that protect St Paul's Cathedral. So if you're lucky, the local plan will somehow coordinate all the policies, and that sort of approach has been taken through now into the sorts of plans you get on council websites. We turn then to what happened after 2004, except that it didn't. Councils were required by the 2004 Act to replace their local plans and structure plans within 3 years. I don't think any council actually achieved that, and some councils still haven't achieved that, which is why you have to go to the council's website and look and see what policies now apply. Because you very often find that what are called saved policies, in other words, policies from the old system that have been left over and which the council's been allowed to keep, still apply. And so what you get now is very often a patchwork quilt, a mixture of the different policies that apply partly from the old system and partly from the new system. And so the new system includes some really specific things. The core strategy is a very general document. It's a bit what I could call motherhood and apple pie. Does everybody understand motherhood and apple pie? It's an Americanism, and in American politics, you could never say anything rude about motherhood because it's a wonderful condition, or about apple pie because it's so American. And the planning policies, in this sense, they always say, we will build lots of new houses and new schools and new office buildings and so on, but at the same time, they will protect the countryside and protect wildlife and protect the historic heritage and the natural heritage. In other words, it's so sort of debased that it's very difficult to extract any real guidance out of it. What's more useful are the site-specific allocations, where, as with the Harpenden plan, you've got a red patch that showed where development would take place. But those tend to be for quite major sites, and so if you're talking about 10 sites or so, and sometimes more than that, it wouldn't be covered by the allocations, and the adopted proposals map ought to translate those things onto a general plan. So in particular, that ought to cover where a conservation area is, where a green belt is, so that you've got a clear idea of which policies apply. But you still come down to a lower level of specific policies. And what's now very common are things called development management policies. And you find very long-winded titles for some of these, but they, in effect, replace what I showed you as the sort of the St. Albans plan, the much more specific and detailed plan. And I think that's where, for an architect in practice, you're mostly going to be looking. That's the key thing. The one thing to emphasize, because we haven't finished, there's still things like, well, let's just turn to neighborhood plans are a next layer down still, where a village community or a particular part of a town might have devised a neighborhood plan. And provided that's been done properly, and often with advice, it's a bit of a growth market, I think, for architects to help to prepare neighborhood plans, although I think often architects volunteer to do it for their local village or something like that without being paid, which is a mistake, I have to advise you. But that's part of the development plan, and then below that, you get the guidance again. And this is a diagram that I devised based on a previous version of planning guidance. But in the middle, and this is in the paperwork, so you haven't got to try to copy it down. In the middle, with a big black line around it, you can see the development plan. That's the stuff to which section 38 bracket 6 applies. The section that says that you have to make a decision in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. You have to start by looking at the development plan. And you have to do that because that's what the council or the planning inspector have to do. They have to decide what the development plan tells them, and then see if there are material considerations that would take you away from the development plan. Of course, one of the problems is that the development plan policies are often quite vague, so that you'll see that there's a development plan policy that says that you must not overshadow your neighbours, or that you must provide enough car parking spaces. But how many car parking spaces is enough? How much of a shadow is too much of a shadow? So there's very often a judgment in deciding whether something complies with the development plan or not. And it seems to me that the way to approach the argument, if you possibly can, is to show why your scheme does comply with the development plan. Again, that doesn't have to be the case. I gave you the example of a site in central London. In another site, in a suburb of Bedford, the suburb was two-storey, very conventional 1960s, 70s housing. And right on the bank of the river, I think it's the River Ouse that goes through Bedford, there had been a very large building, a mill building, that had been badly damaged by fire, and the consensus was that this ought to be knocked down and the site built on. And the question was, what would you build? Because all the policies said you build like what's around it, which is 2 stories, conventional houses. What the architect designed, and what I gave evidence about at an appeal, architectural evidence, was that this was a special site. This was a site for a landmark. In other words, a much bigger building, more like the mill building that had once stood there. And that was again agreed. The material considerations, because of the quality of design, because of the particular location, because of the nature of the surroundings, the particular circumstances meant that in this case, material considerations indicate otherwise. But you start with a development plan. I don't understand why the national planning policy framework isn't part of the development plan. Because what it says it sets out the government's planning policies and how these are to be applied. So it's fundamental to planning decisions. And I think you also start from that. And the planning practice guidance, as I said, is important. Below that, again, you have the supplementary planning documents. You have some other things. You have the local development scheme, which is the scheme which is where the local planning authority. Incidentally, I'm talking about the local planning authority, and sometimes I talk about the council. It's not necessarily the same thing. In the national parks and in the Norfolk Broads, which is like a national park, there is a separate planning authority, which is an amalgam of either the whole or bits of other local authorities. But the local planning authority, shorthand, I might be saying the council. They have to publish various things that don't really influence planning decisions. Then there are supplementary planning document, and then there are local development orders and simplified planning zones, which are ideas that different governments have had about creating sort of planning policy-free zones. London Docklands came about as a result of that, but I don't know of much else that has been involved. Generally speaking, you have to go through the planning system, and you have to take the you have to go through the policies. And just before we leave that, I ought to just say there is currently yet another evolution of the planning system, and some councils are starting to publish things called local plans, by which they seem to mean something like the development management policies document. So something going back to an old-fashioned local plan. Successive governments say that they're streamlining the system. I've just last week submitted a planning statement for an architect in Cambridge, for which I had to look at the core strategy, the development management plan, the village plan, the conservation area appraisal, and another conservation, it was a conservation appraisal to cover the whole district. And each of those documents runs out at between 100 and 200 pages. So you can see that what we're calling the streamlined planning system is only streamlined in the sense that if you're a planning consultant, it costs a lot of money to just go through all the paperwork. I think you ought to be able to do that. Do all of you employ planning consultants in the offices? Some do. I must say, a long time ago, I examined a very senior American architect, very senior in one of the huge worldwide practices. And every time I asked him a question, he said, well, gee, I've got a consultant who does that, or I've got a lawyer who does that, or I've got a guy in the office who does that, and he failed. You're going to have to be able to answer questions about planning, and I think that means that you're going to be able to do it. You're going to be able to write a planning statement because you're going to be able to go back to the policy documents, pick out the key policies. And I don't think, and actually there's legal precedent for saying that you don't have to identify every single policy that might be relevant. You have to identify the key policies and show how they relate to your scheme. So planning permission, the first thing you have to decide, you know what the planning system says, the first thing you have to decide is whether what you want to do needs planning permission. And the first question to answer is whether it's development. And I said at the beginning that there are some words that come up today that have very special planning meanings, and this is one of them. And you can see, and this is in the papers as well, this is in the paperwork as well, in more detail. Section 55 of the Planning Act of the 1990, the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, says that the development is, in a way, two things. It's the carrying out of building, engineering, mining, or other operations. It's often referred to as operational development. Somebody with a shovel or a hammer or a wheelbarrow or whatever it is. In, on, over, or under the land, so anywhere. Or, the second leg, it's the making of a material change in the use of buildings or other land. And that word material comes up again, which means a significant in planning terms, a change. So it's one of two different things. Let me just go through those briefly. Let me take uses first of all. What might be a change of use might be a variation in the type of the use. So obviously a change from a house to an office might be a change in use. That might be quite difficult. Years ago, when I was, I think, secretary, one of the times that I was secretary of the RIBA, an architect had got into trouble with a local planning authority because he'd started out working from his back bedroom in a South London suburb, done well, employed somebody, grown, and eventually had bought himself a house somewhere else, and what had been his original house had in fact become an office. And the question was, at what point had it become an office? So there might be some interesting questions about when the change of use took place. And some changes of use, of course, aren't material. So if you've got a shop selling toys and you want to change it to a shop selling clothes, it's still a shop, and you don't need planning permission to do that. There are some oddities about that, and in the reference pages, I've given you a list of interesting legislation, including some secondary legislation. Those include the permitted development rules and the use classes order, the permitted development order and the use classes order. And you can see from that that there are some changes of use that perhaps unexpectedly don't need planning permission. For example, a funeral undertaker is a shop, whereas a shop that sells cars is not a shop. Are you keeping up? I think the point is that you need to be quite clear about these sorts of questions. And then you have some types of uses that are referred to as sui generis uses. Does everybody understand what sui generis means? Doesn't everybody speak fluent Latin? Obviously not. Sui generis means of its own nature. And there are 2 or 3 pieces of Latin that I shall teach you this afternoon. But something that's of its own nature, the traditional and obvious examples are things like a builder's yard or a coach depot. And you might find a builder's yard that has got an office, obviously, where it was administered, a workshop where somebody would make up kitchen fitments or make up windows or make up bits of joinery, a yard where things were stored, a car park and lorry park where things were parked. It has all of those uses, but it isn't any of those uses. So that if a builder comes to you and says, actually, I don't need an office anymore because I do everything from my laptop in the back of the van, what I want to do is to refurbish the office block and rent it out, you immediately will point out that refurbishing his office block and renting it out as an office block means that he's changed the use and he needs planning permission because it is a builder's yard and it's going to be changed to something that's purely an office. So be careful about things like that. Demolition, I should say, now needs planning permission and counts as works. And then as far as works are concerned, let me just see, I think. Yes, we're coming to that. Yes, let me just take you back and deal with that slide. You need planning permission for anything, because section 57 says that you need planning permission for anything. So there are some changes of use for which you don't need planning permission, and there are some works for which you don't need planning permission. The first thing is minor, is the sort of project that counts as minor works, and that's based on what's called the de minimis principle, the trivial principle. And it's a principle of general English law. Do you have a lecture on general law? Is that yes or no? Yes. Yes, but lots of people didn't notice. Okay, well, there's a general principle, so that if there's a boundary dispute, and you're arguing about 5 centimetres, the court might say, this is too trivial for the law to worry about. So it's a general principle. And if a change is very minor, it can be argued, and we'll come back to it when we're talking about lawful development, it might be argued that planning permission is not necessary at all because it's outside the scope of the planning system. The next stage, and the one that's causing a great deal of trouble, I think, at the moment, is permitted development, because the government, in its wisdom, has decided that getting planning permission was too difficult. And this dates from about 2010 and 2015. There started to be a tendency to greatly increase the scope of permitted development rules to allow things to be done without planning permission. There are 2 problems with that. One is that lots of things now that need to be done, that can be done without planning permission, need to be the subject of an application, what's called a prior notification application, just to confirm that you don't need planning permission. And the other thing is that because the rules are so complex, if you're sensible, you will apply for a certificate from the council, from the local planning authority, to confirm that you don't need planning permission. So you've still got to make an application for one reason or another to demonstrate that you don't need to make an application. Does that make sense? I'm glad it does to you. But it means that the scope for work, the scope for architects tripping over is growing, I think. And I see that in the helpline, and I see that in complaints against architects. And it means there's a need to be very careful about the planning system. Where are we now? Yes, I won't come to that quite yet. There is an important point to make, I think, about the prior notification cases and permitted development, and even de minimis, which is a principle or a concept that's referred to as the fallback situation in planning, which you might have come across, which is to say that you go along to the planning authority and you say, I want a planning permission to build a big extension to the house or whatever it is. And if you don't allow me to have planning permission, then in any case I can go ahead and build something without planning permission, because it would be permitted development and which would be uglier or would have some other defect. In other words, if you don't allow me to do that, my fallback is that I'll do something else that will be the same have the same sort of effect or a worse effect. And that's a valid argument in planning, and you can that's often, I think, often useful. There is a point to be made, I think, about neighbours' rights. One of the problems that has emerged from the permitted development rules is that governments have discovered that the rules have had unintended consequences, and either the courts or the government has started to row back. I don't know if you've seen in the press in the last few days, there have been quite a lot of articles about people building flats out of old factories or old offices that are really very unsatisfactory, and yet they've been allowed to do without planning permission. And I can see a government, when it has a bit of time on its hands, which it doesn't at the moment, but I can see a government going back and looking at those permitted development rules about conversions to residential and taking it away again. And that's already happened in the case of telephone kiosks, where people were wanting to build lots and lots of telephone kiosks, not because many people actually use telephone kiosks to make telephone calls, because they have their own mobile phones in their pockets, and I assume you've all switched yours off, by the way. But because if you have a telephone kiosk, another rule says that you could put an advertisement on it, so that it's a way of getting free advertising space in Oxford Street or something like that. And I think that the government will eventually tighten up on some of the permitted development rules because of the unforeseen consequences that it's had. And I've given you references at the end of the reference pages to the General Permitted Development Order and the Development Management Procedure Order. Now, let's assume that you've worked out what the planning policies say, and you've worked out that you do need planning permission, and the Part 3 question is very likely to lead you to this point, because that's the way they get to ask you about planning applications. You then think about how do you go about making a planning application form? What do you have to do? The first thing to say is that there is a standard electronic application form, but there are lots and lots of different standard application forms. They are better to some extent, because you used to see paper forms where really quite important questions had been missed out because whoever wrote the paper for this or that district council had missed the point. Nowadays, they're pretty much there. You still get some difficult issues. You don't have to put Mr. or Mrs., but you do have to put a first name and a second name, which I think is a pity, because lots of applicants are actually companies, and the legal entity is the company. And I do try to get around that, and I know other architects and planners do try to get around that. You sometimes have, there used to be a particular thing about needing to do tree reports. Some years ago, I did a scheme that was an existing block of flats in fact, Oxted, where what they wanted to do, they were 1960s flats, and what they wanted to do was to put 2 more flats on the top. And it was quite a large block of flats, but in a huge park that was set with some very interesting trees. And the new flats on the roof of the existing block weren't going to affect the trees. But when you ticked the box that said, are there trees on the site, then the machinery wouldn't let you progress until you put in a tree report, till you attached a tree report, and that sort of thing causes trouble. So you sometimes have to game the planning application forms just to deal with technical questions. There is, I understand, a new system being piloted. I think the pilot started last week in Kent and Sussex and Surrey or somewhere like that. But I think that the system will be simplified and will be improved, but it's still going to be a bit like that. I think be careful about using the combined forms and think ahead a bit. It's very common to use a combined planning application and listed building consent form. I know I'm not going to come to listed building consent until later, but let me just say that there are some things which might need listed building consent, there are some things which might need planning permission, and there are some things which might need both. And so to use one form can cause trouble later on when you're trying to decide what the issues are. But I'll come back to that under the heading of listed buildings. And these are the sorts of things, first of all, the big question for you is going to be whether it should be outline or full planning permission. Have you all come across that? Do you all make planning applications in your offices? I think quite a lot of you do. I think outline planning application forms you need to know about because they're valuable in land dealing terms. In the UK, and I ought perhaps to have emphasised the differences earlier on, mostly what I'm talking about is England. Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland have some differences. Northern Ireland has some quite significant differences in administrative terms, but Wales and Scotland have different planning policies. Scotland, for example, is upgrading its chief planning officers in its regions, and Wales is developing its own planning policies that are, as it were, drifting away from the English version. But everywhere in the UK, and we'll come to this, but the legal system is the same, and a planning decision is not a foregone conclusion. If you go to elsewhere in Europe, and I have been registered in Spain for many years, but in Spain and Germany and France, first of all, you have to have an architect to sign off the drawings. You can't make a planning application for most things, and certainly for more major projects, unless you're an architect, which is a good idea for architects. Does everybody agree with that? I think it is quite a good idea. But here, of course, if material considerations indicate otherwise, which is an expression I may have already mentioned, you might not get permission if the development plan says permission will be granted, or you might get permission when the development plan says permission ought not to be granted. So you can't tell whether a piece of land is valuable until you've got a permission. Whereas in much of Europe, if the piece of land is designated as urbanizable land, then it's valuable. You can put it on the market and sell it for a property value. In the UK, if it's designated in the plan, you can put it on the market and sell it for what is called hope value. You hope that you get planning permission. That means it's worth more than a field, but less than a residential plot. And the outline planning application defines the value by saying planning permission can be granted, but without going into a lot of detail. Increasingly, quite a lot of detail is gone into. You don't have to, and this is in the notes at the bottom of page 3, you don't have to produce the landscape, the scale, the appearance, the access, and the landscaping. But I don't frankly see how you can make an application without the access being more or less defined. And really, to understand what can be achieved on a relatively difficult site, and all sites are difficult, you need to have some idea of the scale and the design. Are you talking about 2-story houses or 3-story houses, or are you talking about an office block? Are you talking about 10 houses or 15 houses? Whatever the answer is, has an effect on the value of the land and has an effect on what you might do. The time limits are important. You might have 3 years for submission of reserved matters and 2 years for final details, and 2 years to commence. But sometimes, depending on the wording, that leaves you with 3 years overall. So be very careful about outline planning applications anyway. The full planning application, which is the one that you really need to know about, is a really good question for examiners to put to you, because you ought to be able to trot this off. And then the examiner says to you, well, now that you've got part A of the question right, let's discuss what you would put in the design and access statement, or what you might need in the way of explanatory material. Do you see the way that the exam is working? An easy starter to put you at your ease, and then asking you to explain what you know, not only testing your knowledge, but testing your understanding and the application of the knowledge. So you have to submit the form. I think there are still a few forms. There's one which I'll come to about listed buildings, where you can't do it electronically, but mostly they're electronic. You have to submit an ownership certificate, certificates A, B, C, D. Do you all know about ownership certificates? You know that certificate A is the certificate that says my client owns the land. Is that right? It's actually not right. It's a trick question, because what the certificate says is that my client is the only owner of the land. And I've got a current case for an architect also in Cambridge, where there's an argument about who owns the access drive. I think in this case, it's the architect's client owns the access drive. But if the architect's client hadn't been the owner of the access drive, then certificate B would have been served to tell the freehold owner of the drive how to, the planning application was being made. And this is again an important difference between the UK system and some other systems. In the Republic of Ireland, you can make an application on somebody else's land, but only if the landowner has written a letter to say that it's agreed. In the UK, you can make an application on somebody else's land, but you have to tell the landowner what you're doing so the landowner can object. It might be foolish to make an application on somebody else's land, because if you get planning permission, then the planning permission runs with the land. It's not your personal planning permission. If you can make it clear that it's your personal design because of copyright, then you might have a hold. But basically, you've increased the value of somebody else's land. So generally, it's done when there's an agreement in place between a developer who's paying for the planning application and a landowner who owns an interesting piece of land but doesn't have the money to spare to make a planning application. Ownership certificates A and B are the typical ones. Ownership certificates C and D apply when there is some gap in knowledge about the ownership. Certificate D is when nobody knows who the owner is of any of the land, and certificate C is where part of the land is owned by somebody unknown. And that can happen more often than you think. In 19th century terraces, you often have little alleyways between the houses, and you find that whereas they were originally probably conveyed with one house or the other house, over the years they've been forgotten about. So nobody knows who they belong to. They might even belong to the original builder who died in 1880. And I remember dealing with a case in Luton, in this case, where it was a block of flats, and what would now be called, well, they weren't affordable flats, but they were not expensive flats. And they had a garage in a separate block somewhere else. And they had been sold on over the years, and each flat with its garage. The only thing is that over the years, about 10% of the garages had been forgotten about, which meant that when the council wanted to demolish the garages, to do a deal with the ground landlords and the owners to demolish all the garages, partly because the garages were being used to burn stolen cars and to do drugs and things like that. It was really not a good place. We had to work out what to do about these missing owners who might well have died 20 years ago. And we fortunately had a very supportive council who wanted to see something done, and they agreed that they would use their compulsory purchase powers to buy in the vacant or the unknown ownership plots, and then put money in a fund so that if an owner ever turned up, which seems very unlikely, then they would be entitled to actually quite a small amount of money as a result of this land having been acquired by the council. The agricultural holding certificate always appears. That's rare. Does anybody know what an agricultural holding is? No, that's very sensible of you not to answer. I've only had 2 people answer and get that right, and they were both children of farmers, because the Agricultural Holdings Act, I think 1948, was what established this. And it's because agricultural tenants have special protection of their tenancy that there is a special certificate. So just because a piece of land is a field and has got some sheep grazing on it or a horse grazing on it or something, doesn't make it an agricultural holding. So watch out. I think in my career I've only once answered yes to the agricultural holding certificate. You have to pay the application fee. Incidentally, I think last autumn it was, the planning portal introduced a new scheme by which they charge a bit extra. I think they're going to modify the scale, but they're charging a bit extra to handle the fee, and in practice I always do that. I think you more or less have to do that because it's too complicated not to. What I would do, though, is always make the client pay the application fee. Does everybody do that anyway? I'm bound to say that, having given you that strong advice, I don't always do that. Sometimes, you know, it's a very long established client who I know I'm going to get paid by and so on. But you'd be surprised how often it causes trouble. First of all, if there is ever a dispute, then if you've paid the fee, then that's a bit more for there to be a dispute about. But also, what sticks in my mind is an adjudication case that I dealt with a little while ago, where the client's case was that he didn't know that the architect had got so far ahead as to make the planning application because and hadn't asked the client's approval for the planning application scheme. And what made that client's position very difficult was that the client had paid the planning application fee. So it's very difficult for the client to say that he didn't know about the planning application. I think that was important. I think in this case the client did have some good arguments, but nevertheless, one of the common criticisms you see, and I suspect that the ARB may be telling you tomorrow, is that one of the commonest criticisms of architects is failure to communicate and dealing with the planning process and explaining what's going on and when is important, and this step in the process is clearly evidenced, it's clearly demonstrated by the application fee. The site plan really should be ordnance survey. I think it's still true that sort of perversely there is no strict rule of law that says it must be an ordnance survey plan, but I think it must. Be careful, I'm just dealing with a case now which would be a little block of flats, which I'm doing the drawing for, but where the ordnance survey plan is clearly wrong. That's really very, very unusual. But watch out for that. It was really only when we got to grips with the survey and a combination of really very old deeds that showed how the site had been assembled, that it showed that the ordnance survey plan was based on an old boundary that no longer exists. And I don't know whether they do their revised surveys from aerial photos now or what, but the site's quite overgrown. And the new boundary has been missed. You have to do drawings, obviously. These days you have to put north points on and scale bars on because everybody downloads them electronically. So an A1 plan is printed off at A4 and you need a scale bar. But be very careful about what you're saying, what's to scale and what's not to scale. When we come to enforcement, I'll try not to mention it again, but I dealt some years ago, acted for an architect who had built a house, and the design was 2.5 stories. He made it as a timber frame design, and the timber frame manufacturer had quite significantly increased the overall height. He'd increased the beam depths at each floor, and the company had increased, I think, also the floor-to-ceiling heights. According to the local planning authority, the building came out at just under 70 centimetres too high on a 2.5-storey building. On my calculation, it came out at 43 centimetres too high. So it's less than it's about an A3 piece of paper, something like that. But the council made us go to appeal on that, and we had a very expensive planning appeal and enforcement notice appeal, which he won in the end, but caused a great deal of heartache. And the main reason that happened was that the architect had put in some street scene drawings that showed the buildings either side. Of course, you don't have the power to go onto next door's land and measure it. In this case, the critical next door building was rendered, so you couldn't count the bricks to find out how high it was. And he got it wrong. It was as simple as that. And a great deal flowed from that. So be very careful about the accuracy of drawings. You quite often see the Lasdon drawings of the Kensington Barracks just behind Hyde Park with a photograph shown against his sketch drawings that got planning permission. And they are really very different. You would be in I think, a great deal of trouble now if that came up. You have to be very precise about the drawings. The design and access statement is usually a formal requirement, not always, but I always do put in some sort of design and access statement. I would say you should always cover the design. You should always explain why yours is a great design, and architects are often, in my experience, very good at doing that. You should include the access, although the access is often not a very substantial part of the statement. It's usually obvious and quite short. I would always add in the planning policy background, just identify the policies and identify why your scheme complies with the policies, and then any other material considerations like the fallback position if there is one, like the planning history if there is one, those sorts of issues. Explanatory material, this is an example. I should say that you'll notice that there is nothing on there that requires an architect, and you don't have to have an architect here. And in some cases, in the planning guidance, in the National Planning Policy Framework, you will be told that there should be appropriate expertise. It doesn't go so far as to say, on a listed building, you must have a conservation architect, but it does say appropriate experience. My definition of a conservation architect is an architect that I met some years ago in, I think it was in Ely, and I was advising her on a case, and one of her staff came into the office and said, this building that we're working on, and it was somewhere in Norfolk, we need to find some bricks to match this. And she came in with a brick in her hand. And my client looked at it and said, oh, you'll get that in such and such a pit near Norwich, about 4 meters below the surface of the ground, about 4 meters down in the clay. That's what I call a historic buildings expert. I think for most 19th century buildings that have been kicked around over the centuries, you don't need that level of detail. But nevertheless, watch out and make sure that you know what you're talking about, and certainly cover listing issues. Under the heading of flora and fauna, I've got into trouble I was doing a scheme on Chorleywood Common. Does anyone know Chorleywood Common? Chorleywood Common Chorleywood is really a London suburb, and it's a very pleasant location. It's actually a very wealthy location, and there's a golf course and a cricket ground on the common, and a very old cricket pavilion. But there are also some ponds, and the common is, I was going to say crawling with newts. It's a host to a population of great crested newts. Does everybody know great crested newts? They are scarce in some parts of the world. They are relatively scarce here. They're very heavily protected. And everybody knew that the common was covered in great crested newts. And so my statement was to the effect that everybody knows it's great crested newts territory. And so the point of the fauna of the wildlife statement was to explain how we were going to avoid killing great crested newts, because what they would do would be to forage at night, to go looking for their insects and slugs at night, hide up during the day, and then start again the next night. And of course, when it comes to hiding up early in the morning, under the wheels of a JCB, if you're a great crested newt, looks very comfortable, until somebody comes and moves the JCB in the morning. And so what we were going to have to do was to build a plastic fence all the way around the site. And this is absolutely straightforward, cut and paste from Natural England guidance. But it took a long time to convince the local planning authority that I didn't need to have a PhD in biology in order to write that down. They did in the end accept it, but it was the sort of thing that you find, you argue about the need for niche consultants. Potential existing contamination, that's sort of obvious. If you can deal with that by conditions, but be warned that sometimes in the depths of the countryside you find, and there was, I don't think it was here, but there was an exam question a few years ago, I think it was an AA question, where the site was an old farmyard. And I would have said that one of the potential issues was contamination, because farmers often used to fill tractors with diesel and to replace the oil, and it got spilt in the farmyard. So you might get a hot spot, you might get a contaminated patch of ground, even in the countryside in a farm where you would think it wasn't going to be. There's the question of potential pollution, of course, particularly noise, disturbance, things like that. Traffic and highways, you often need a highway engineer, but in the bundle of references, you'll see the reference to traffic and roads, which is a document that gives some good guidance about sight lines, visibility lines at junctions that you need to deal with. Design you can write about. Areas of outstanding natural beauty are areas where it's desirable to maintain a high quality of design, and often I'm afraid that's translated as meaning copy the historic vernacular in the next village. That's not necessarily what's required. It's sometimes how it's interpreted, but look carefully at design issues in that sort of context. And then you come to the question of pre-application consultations. I've already talked about prior notification applications where you wouldn't have to do so much. Pre-application, I'm just in the process of doing a couple at the moment, where the aim, no, at least three I can think of, where the aim is to narrow down what we're going to have to produce niche reports on. So one is a site in Dunstable in Bedfordshire, where the garden's overgrown, we want to build a block of flats, but I'm convinced that there should be no need for a wildlife study or a contamination study. There is going to be a need for a highway assessment because the site's going to come out onto a main road next to another access. But I hope to narrow down the actual planning application, and I've got a similar one in Hammersmith, where what we want to do is to narrow down what we've got to submit. You then, just on pre-applications, have lots of you done pre-applications? I think a few have. And have you all had good experiences of them? I think yes, there are some people do have good experiences, and quite a lot of people don't, I think. And it's only anecdotal, but my impression is that the experience on small-scale schemes is not so good for two reasons. I think one is that you get quite junior people who then might be overturned higher up, whereas on a more substantial application, you get a higher level advice and therefore better quality advice, and you do actually get advice that helps you to narrow down. You might get advice that says, no, you don't need to do a wildlife study, and that will be accepted and followed through. The other thing that I find is that if you ask for written statements on the pre-application advice, obviously as soon as somebody's got to go in writing, they've got to cover any possible future criticism. So you'll find that a written advice, in my experience, often comes out as rather more negative for very sensible human reasons, but rather more negative than the discussion that you had. And so sometimes I say, and also you have to wait a long time sometimes for written advice. So sometimes I say, thank you for the advice. You don't need to write it down. We'll go away and take it. Just remind everybody in the room what the key advice has been. So you turn to the determination of planning applications. Section 38 bracket 6. Does everybody remember section 38 bracket 6? When the examiner asks you if you've heard of section 38 bracket 6, you'll all say yes. And the point is that you start with a development plan. You look at the National Planning Policy Framework and the planning practice guidance. You look at the emerging policies and other policies, and you look at the other material considerations. Bear in mind, and I think this is a flaw, and this is my opinion, not the government's opinion, obviously, but there's the flaw in the National Planning Policy Framework is that it says that there is a presumption in favour of sustainable development. Does everybody understand what sustainable development is? If anybody does, can you come to me afterwards and explain it to me? Because I think it's a really nebulous concept that can mean almost anything you want it to mean. There's a view among lawyers, I think, that because of the way the original 1947 Act was framed, and because of the principle that an Englishman's home is his castle and an Englishwoman's home is her castle, although that's not how it was said 150 years ago. But because of property rights, you ought to be allowed to do whatever you want to do with your property unless it harms somebody else. And I think that's being eroded. It either harms your next door neighbour or it harms the public at large. But I think that idea is being eroded. I think we're moving towards what I could call a precautionary principle, which is that you're not allowed to do anything to your property unless you can prove that everything will be all right. Do you understand the difference? It's, I think, quite a subtle difference, but important in the complexity of the planning system. And good design is, and this is something that the RIBA achieved, and well done. The RIBA achieved the incorporation of good design as an aim of the planning system, and it is. The problem, of course, is the subtext, which is what is one person's good design is somebody else's copy of a pseudo rural tradition. There was, under the heading of planning guidance, I think the first planning guidance was the Essex Design Guide, which came out in the 1970s, I think. And it had pictures of little red brick houses with red tiles and sometimes tile hanging and sometimes rendering, and with a green tick against it. And then it had next to it a horizontal white rendered box with horizontal windows and a very narrow pilotis with a big red cross against it, as not allowable in Essex. And I think if you look at it carefully, it is, in fact, Corbusier's Villa Savoie that would not be allowed in Essex. And that sort of mentality has, I think, flowed through. So there's argument about design and what good design means. I need to just touch on things that sort of aren't material considerations. The first one is property ownership. It's not a material consideration as to who owns a particular property, and it's not a material consideration that somebody has easements across land. Rights of way, if it's a public footpath, something might be might be a planning consideration. But what I could say is that such things as covenants do illustrate the character of the area. So the fact that a series of covenants exists might be illustrative of the fact that this is an area of low density development. Having considered all of these things, the council decides whether to grant planning permission. They grant planning permission subject to conditions, almost always. It is possible, it's lawful to apply for planning permission retrospectively. That is to say, to apply for planning permission for something that's already happened. And in that case, it might be that planning permission is granted without conditions, because there's no condition that the work's got to be started within a certain time. There's no condition that a certain type of brick's got to be used, because that's the brick that's there. If permission is granted, that's still the brick that's there. But generally speaking, there will be two standard conditions. One is the time limits condition, that the work must be, the permission must be implemented, and this is another word that I have to translate into English, because implemented means commenced or started, really, for most purposes. So when you're building a building, when did you start building the building? We'll come back to that under the heading reinforcement later on this afternoon, because there are some pitfalls around that. There will be a condition about approved drawings. If it's an appeal decision, it will list the drawings, and increasingly planning permissions issued by a local planning authority list the drawings. Do bear in mind the importance of what are called negative conditions. They're sometimes called Grampian conditions because they come from what was then a House of Lords case, now would be a Supreme Court case, because it changed to be the Supreme Court, about imposing a condition that says you mustn't start. In the particular case, it was about a supermarket, and it was about building a road. And what was said was that you mustn't start building the supermarket until there's a proper road. Previously, it was more complicated than that. But sometimes a Grampian condition is important and useful. And be aware that negative conditions and pre-commencement conditions can be conditions precedent. So if you fail to obey the condition, if you fail to comply with the condition, then you might have lost the whole planning permission. So be very careful. When I send a planning permission to a client, I do say, be very aware of the conditions, and be very aware that you need to allow time to submit, for example, details of the bricks that we're going to use in time for the local planning authority to approve them before we start work, if that's what we have to do. Because sometimes people leave you too little time. We'll come back to that. And again, on the condition, as the building goes up, you sometimes find that the building doesn't turn out exactly like the planning drawings. In fact, has anybody ever had a building that turned out exactly like the planning permission drawings? I think nobody at all. I think I never have either. The point is something changes, and so it's useful, I think, these days where everybody's very litigious, very inclined to sue somebody, and especially very inclined to blame the architect, to make sure that if plans are changed, then you just apply to the council to vary the condition. And that's the way I would deal with it. I wouldn't deal with it as a minor amendment. I'd deal with it as a variation of conditions to substitute the new plan. Also, you have to be very aware of the community infrastructure levy, often called SIL, and Section 106 agreements. You can't have a positive planning condition. The example that used to be given, you can't have a a planning permission for a shop that says the shop display has got to be dusted once a month, has got to be renewed once every couple of months. You can't have a housing planning permission that says that the front lawn has got to be mowed once a week or twice or once a fortnight or whatever it is, because it's a positive restriction. What you can do is to impose a Section 106 agreement, and those are mostly used these days to require some houses to be affordable houses. You know what I mean by affordable houses, houses for rent or shared ownership or something like that. And increasingly, the contribution of money for sewers, for schools, for libraries, for all the other things that the local planning authority or some other authority, maybe the county council as a highway authority, has to provide, those can be done by a community infrastructure levy. And architects increasingly get drawn into that. I had quite an unhappy case, which I'll leave you with as we break, where an architect had forgotten to send in the form to the council that said, by the way, my client is claiming the small extensions exemption, which would have been allowed in this particular borough. It was a West London borough. The borough should have notified the client, but didn't. I think that the borough was at fault. This was a helpline case, and the architect notified her insurers. But the long and short of it was that there was less than £2,000 at stake, and so the insurers simply paid up because it was cheaper than arguing about it. And that, of course, caused a problem for future premiums for the architect, and also a future issue for her record. So be very cautious. This is not something I've yet got much experience about, but I suspect that as time goes on, architects are going to get drawn into CIL issues. And not very long ago, I had a case where somebody had built a warehouse, hadn't paid the CIL, and had a bill for £20,000 going back a number of years. And I had to advise that he was stuck with it. He couldn't avoid the payment. That's a cheerful note on which to go and get a coffee, don't you think? Can you be back here at, is it 2:45 you have to be back here? Oh, it's 4, is it? 4 o'clock, okay. 4 o'clock. To pick up one particular point that a couple of people mentioned to me during the break, which is to do with something I've had to touch on. The trouble is that to do all of this in just an afternoon is really quite difficult, and it means that some things everything I'm skating over a bit. But I did mention the issue of government guidance, the National Planning Policy Framework and the Planning Practice Guidance. You also find on those websites some specific things. And on page 11 of the references, I've given you, written out in full, some of the really useful things. At the bottom of the page, I mentioned Manual for Streets, which, unlike some other things, gives you some quite detailed dimensions for sight lines and so on at junctions, and dimensions for roads and so on, which are referred to. And also at the bottom of the page, there's something called the Technical Housing Standards, which are increasingly frequently referred to. They are, I think, slightly different from the flat sizes and so on in the London plan, so watch out. But those are quite specific and useful. And also the permitted development rights is technical guidance, and it was DCLG at the time. I think DCLG has now added digital to its title and housing. But the point is, in the process of streamlining the system, the permitted development rules, and I've given you that higher up the page, the general permitted development order, runs to, I think, something like 250 pages. And because that's not clear enough, the technical guidance just on householder cases runs to, I think, about another 70 or 74 pages, which reinforces the point I was making about streamlining not being streamlining by any measure that I understand. I'll come back again to some of these questions when we're talking about enforcement, but let's move on to planning appeals and related appeals. And a great deal of what I've got to say is you can take as applying to appeals for listed building consent, in other words, for alterations to listed buildings, and appeals in enforcement cases, so appeals where somebody wants you to knock something down. And although I'm referring to planning appeals, the system is sort of homogenized, if I can call it that. It's an overarching system. And there are similar processes for things like closing footpaths or putting up advertisements. These sorts of things also run through the same system. So starting out, the appeal is made by an aggrieved party. And in the UK, that means the applicant. In the Republic of Ireland, once planning permission is granted, a next-door neighbour has an opportunity to appeal against the grant of planning permission. And sometimes you hear that promoted here by the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, I think you'll find. And I would urge you, if you ever get asked whether that's a good idea, say no. It hugely increases the number of planning appeals per head of population, and it hugely slows down the planning system. The appeal is made to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State varies. And at the moment, it's I think it's the Secretary of State for Digital Communities, Housing and Local Government, but it's just called the Secretary of State. In reality, the appeal organisation is something called the Planning Inspectorate, which is based in Bristol. And the appeals are dealt with by a body of people called planning inspectors. And there are, I think it's less than 300, it may be about 250, of whom a proportion are part-timers like myself and a proportion of full-time civil servants. Of course, the more substantial cases are dealt with by full-time civil servants. The appeal is to be made within 6 months, but that's not the case for householder cases and some small commercial cases. There, it's only 12 weeks, and I've got a case at the moment where only, I think, 3 or 4 days ago, I had to remind the architect whose client hadn't replied to the question whether we should do an appeal or not, that we were going to run out of time, because although it was quite a substantial scheme in West London, actually it's only a householder scheme, if I can say only. It's important to the family, of course, but it means that we've got a limited time for appeal, and when the appeal goes in, everything's got to be done. That basically the whole statement's got to be written, and the council has only a very, very limited opportunity to make a response, and the neighbours don't have an opportunity at all to give a response. So I think that's to our advantage in this case, but what I'm going to tell you about, and what I suspect examiners will ask you about, is the sort of the bigger case and that's what I'm going to be concentrating on. And the first thing to say is that you have 3 reasons why you might want to appeal. The first is you might be refused planning permission or listed building consent or something else. The second is that the local planning authority might not have made up their mind, might not have made a decision. That's often called, it's a failure to determine. It's a failure to decide, translating back into English. Determine means decide. That's often called a deemed refusal. Strictly, it's not a deemed refusal. It's simply no decision at all. But it often is, in effect, a refusal. It's just that the council haven't got round to writing up their reasons. I think it's quite often useful to have an actual refusal, because then you know what ground you're fighting on. You know what the case is that you have to answer. And the other thing to be very mindful of is that if you appeal the council's failure to determine, if you appeal on the grounds the council haven't made a decision, then you're in the hands of the planning inspectorate. If the council pop up and say, well, actually, now we've had another fortnight to think about it, now we've had another 2 weeks to think about it, we want to grant planning permission, they can't. You have to make a new planning application, which you sometimes do. You sometimes make planning applications in parallel so that you can lodge an appeal for one and hope to get a permission for the other one. But what you don't want to do is to be out of touch with the local planning authority so that you appeal and then find that the council were about to give you planning permission anyway. The other thing is that when planning permission is granted, and granted subject to conditions, you might want to appeal against a condition. You have to do that rather carefully, and I haven't time to explain where the pitfall might lie, but in some cases, if you appeal in the wrong way against a condition, you might have an inspector come along and say, well, actually, I agree with the appellant that the condition that says the bricks have to be red is quite wrong and shouldn't be applied. But on the other hand, I disagree with the council. I think that this house shouldn't be built anyway, and I therefore remove planning permission altogether. And obviously that's seriously bad news for the client who wants to build a house, and if it has to be red bricks, well, so be it. You need to be very careful about appealing against conditions. And usually conditions can be dealt with by a new application to the council rather than an appeal. And the example I'd give of that is a house that I obtained planning permission for a short while ago, which was a replacement house in the Greenbelt and in Hertfordshire. And it had a basement. It was quite a lot bigger in floor space than the original bungalow. And it was a 1950s bungalow that had real asbestos slates on the roof, made of real asbestos, which is not a great idea. And it had what were called spatterdash on the walls. Does anybody work with spatterdash now? Does everybody know what spatterdash is? What you do is you render the outside of often a solid brickwork wall. You render it while the render is still wet. You throw handfuls of gravel at it with a spade or a shovel or something to make it all knobbly. And then when it's all knobbly, you paint it, and you get a sort of knobbly effect. Does anybody like that? It was very fashionable about 60 or 70 years ago. And in granting planning permission for a new house, the council had imposed a condition that they said the materials to be used in the construction of the new house shall match those that are used in the existing house. It's obviously a standard condition that they impose on house extensions, and it was just a mistake. And they acknowledged it was just a mistake. We could have appealed. What we did, of course, was to apply to have the condition removed, and while they were doing that, we went ahead and dug the foundations and built the basement, so that by the time we got the permission agreeing to the bricks that we wanted in the first place, we were in the right time scale to do that. But you can see that although you can appeal against conditions, there might be a better way of doing it. The appeal is dealt with, as I said, by the planning inspectorate, and you do get these guidance notes both on the planning practice guidance, and I think also the planning inspectorate do their own guidance notes now. And when you fill in the appeal form, there are lots of interactive questions. Bear in mind in particular the whole question of ownership certificates again, and make sure you don't trip up over that. But here is another good question for candidates. What are the 3 ways of dealing with a planning appeal? And the answer is written representations, or a hearing, or a public inquiry. And by the way, it's an inquiry, not an enquiry. The planning inspectorate now has the power to decide which it's going to be. And the great majority of planning appeals are dealt with by written representations, which I regret because I don't think it necessarily gives the inspector a chance to question people and get to the bottom of what the real issues are, especially when you have rather bland comments that say that the proposed building is out of character or overbearing or not in keeping with the surroundings or something like that. That doesn't really tell you much about what people are really worried about. I think hearings are good for architects because I think architects are often good at sitting around a table and explaining what's good about their scheme. And a hearing is relatively informal. It's dominated by the inspector who leads the debate and who picks out a series of topics to talk about. It might be that there's a design issue, that there is a highways issue, and there's a question about whether a tree is going to be damaged or something like that. The public inquiry is, to most people's minds, much more formal, much more serious. You find that barristers say that they don't think it's formal, but that's because barristers don't wear wigs in public inquiries, and because barristers usually sit down when they're cross-examining. But for all other purposes, it's very, very serious, and you need to be very aware of the rigors of cross-examination. You hear about people breaking down in tears in cross-examination. There was a criminal case recently where a woman who was a witness after ruthless cross-examination by the barrister defending her rapist went home and killed herself. It can be very, very traumatic. I've seen people in tears in planning appeals. Be very careful and remember that when you're giving your evidence, be very sure about the facts that you're giving and be very sure about the opinions that you're given. You're quite likely to be asked to give evidence of opinion. So when somebody is trying to make you look like an idiot, because that makes you look weak and rather disparages the rest of your evidence, try to be very clear as to why you hold opinions, not just, I think this is a great design, but I think this is a great design because of the relationship between light and dark, because of the scale compared with other buildings, because of the materials that are used, whatever it may be. And remember, and I come back to the fact that I do, from time to time, do adjudications, and I like doing adjudications as hearings, because you get to see the people involved and you get to understand better what they really think about things. Have you had somebody already talk to you about adjudication and arbitration and things like that? And I assume that you're quite often told that most adjudications are being done by written representations. Is that what you're being told? There's a sort of mixed view about that. I think they quite often are, but I think especially when something's come at the end of a project, it's often quite useful to see the people involved. And I've sometimes done adjudications for small domestic things, sitting around somebody's dining room table, that sort of thing. Let's see where we are. Oh, the other thing to say is that public inquiries, you have to be rigorous, but provided you're well prepared, it's not like a courtroom drama. You never see the planning officer break down and say, all right, grant planning permission after all. It always is very long drawn out. The appeal decision, it can't be perverse, is the critical thing. And there's a definition of perverse, which is called Wednesbury perverse. Does anybody come from Wednesbury? I think I feel sorry for Wednesbury. Wednesbury is a small town in the Midlands, and whereas Runnymede is the home of Magna Carta and Cambridge is the home of learning, Wednesbury is the home of unreasonableness. And it's only because of a court case many years ago, it must be half a century ago, in which the Wednesbury Council was found to have held an opinion that no reasonable counsel should have held, and that's now the definition of unreasonableness. So it's quite an extreme term, but an inspector can't be unreasonable, and if an inspector's unreasonable, then the decision is likely to be overturned. The next thing to remember particularly, and one measure of unreasonableness is simply getting the facts wrong. I'll come to the courts in a moment, but if an inspector gets the facts wrong, then that may be held to be an error in law, and the courts can only overturn a case on a matter of law. They can't overturn a case on the basis that the inspector had held a wrong opinion, unless it was it was a perverse opinion, a Wednesbury unreasonable opinion. So if the inspector just says, I think this is a poor design and it's out of proportion and it's too big for its surroundings, it's practically impossible for a judge to interfere with that. If the inspector says this new house would be undesirable, no, I'll put it a different way. This new house is perfectly acceptable because it's not in a conservation area, and it turns out that it is in a conservation area, then of course that's wrong in law, and that decision would be quashed. In an odd sort of way, and this is an actual case, if the inspector says, I think this house would be entirely acceptable in the conservation area, and it turns out that it's not a conservation area, the inspector's got it wrong, but the judge would say, and the judge did say, but if the inspector thought that this pretty village was a conservation area, then having discovered that it wasn't a conservation area, it would be even more likely that it would be allowed. And so the council's challenge in the High Court, pointing out the inspector's mistake, was nevertheless quashed because the judge said, well, if it goes back to the inspector, then the inspector's going to reach the same opinion, but even more strongly. So bear in mind that when a decision goes down in court, it goes down and has to be redecided. It's not that it's overturned and goes in the opposite direction. Yes, and the final thing I think on appeals is the question of costs. Costs, you've been told in court, you've been told already that costs, the winner gets costs. Is that what you've been told? And the same thing would be true in arbitration. In adjudication, I think they're often halved. Sometimes, some adjudicators, I think, more often give costs to the winning side. In appeals, every side pays their own costs unless one side behaves unreasonably. And there can be, I suppose, two different ways of being unreasonable if you want to practice being unreasonable. One is not to turn up for the hearing, or not to submit your statements in time. Although if you don't submit your statements in time, probably all that's going to happen is that the inspector is going to take no notice of the inspector that you say, and you're going to have a difficult time explaining to a client that your really good arguments were never considered by the inspector because you submitted them too late. And the next thing to do would be, of course, to notify your professional indemnity insurers, because what's going to happen next? The client's going to start worrying about the costs of the appeal that are wasted, but also about maybe the lost development value. So the first way of going wrong would be to just not comply with the procedural rules. The other way of going wrong, and the most common way of going wrong in court, is to promote an unreasonable argument. And the example that I can think of in this is and it wasn't an architect, it was a planning consultant. And it was a case in the countryside, at the edge of a village, where planning permission had been refused for a new house outside the village in the corner of a field. Planning permission had been refused. I think it went to appeal and was turned down. And a few years later, a new planning application was made, a new refusal was issued, a new refusal notice was issued, and a new appeal was lodged. And of course, it failed on appeal again. And I think in this case, the local planning authority didn't ask for costs. But I think that's the sort of case where if they had asked for costs, they would have got costs. And I think as the regime has changed and we've all become a bit more strict, I think these days the inspector would exercise the power of the inspector to institute a claim for costs. And so instead of being a planning consultant, it had been an architect and it had been you, I think you would have been at risk of costs. So be very careful to warn clients about the costs regime. You can't proceed with an unreasonable argument. And bear in mind that the new RIBA code and the ARB code tell you that if you're offering something as your professional opinion, then it has to be your professional opinion. I'll come to that again on the heading of enforcement, but you're not just a mouthpiece for the client. You have to tell the truth. A lawyer who's a mouthpiece for a client has to say what the client says is true. The lawyer doesn't have to believe it. I think that's an important difference. I think we now come, just in passing, there's a heading in my crib notes on page 5 about maladministration, which sometimes people ask me about, but rarely. There is a process by which, if a local planning authority has not administered the process properly, then there can be a claim of maladministration, and councils are sometimes told that they ought to pay some compensation. I think they still can't be forced to pay compensation, but they can be criticised, and it's important to councils not to be found guilty of maladministration. In practice, however, I think it's quite difficult to find a case of maladministration, and also the sorts of compensation that are payable are very small, and in a planning case, the decision can't be undone. If a planning application has been refused, then the remedy is to go to appeal. If the planning permission has been granted and neighbours are upset, or local amenity society is upset, or somebody else is upset, then the remedy is go to court to have the planning permission quashed, which is expensive and also which runs the risk of paying the other side's costs in court. And I've sometimes come across that. It's usually done. David Cameron in his day complained about the proliferation of those sorts of cases, often being run for commercial reasons. I got a planning permission for somebody running an airport car park, actually near Luton Airport, where somebody running a rival car park actually wanted us closed down. And so they went to the High Court. They spent a lot of money on going to the High Court in the hope of winning a summer season with no competition. And they didn't succeed. And in any case, we continued to operate. So for commercial reasons, sometimes people go to the High Court, but it's rare. And it's rare to get a planning permission or indeed an appeal decision quashed, overturned. The next session, the historic environment, deals with a number of different areas, and in particular, it deals with listed buildings and conservation areas, because those are designated heritage assets. And then there's a growing area, I think, to think about for non-designated heritage assets. And I used to skate over those. I used to skate over the question of locally listed buildings or buildings of townscape value or buildings of local interest or whatever. Because if they weren't listed buildings, they really weren't protected. And so somebody could come along and demolish them and then argue about the replacement. That, for various reasons which I'll come to, is no longer true. And therefore, you do have to think about heritage assets that are, I think, any time up to the Second World War. The 1947 Act came into effect on the 1st of July 1948, which means that it seems to me that anything that predates the 1st of July 1948 can be considered to be a heritage asset. Even subsequent things. I learned the other day that obviously there are quite a lot of modern buildings now, including the regatta headquarters at Henley, right on the river, has become a listed building. And that's a mixed blessing, because it means you have the kudos and the status and potentially a VAT saving for doing repairs or for doing alterations. Not repairs, for doing alterations. But it does mean that it restricts what can be done. As a general proposition, I would say, on heritage assets, whether or not they're listed, look back at section 16. It's now section 16, but look back at that in the National Planning Policy Framework. And I think the first thing to say is that somebody should be doing an appraisal. So I've advised parish councils on occasions that if they want to defend their village conservation area, they need to have an appraisal in place so that they can show why, for example, a particular site is an important open area, or why there's a view, or why there's a gap between buildings that's important in the street scene or important as a view to the medieval church or something like that. A village appraisal is really important, and listed building appraisals, you get better appraisals now in the list entry itself than you used to, but very often I think an appraisal by the architect, if you're working on a listed building, is important. And as a general proposition, the other thing I wanted to particularly mention is this question of substantial or less than substantial harm, which is that, and that's in the appendices as well. And I think that substantial harm is akin to, similar to, not necessarily exactly the same as, but similar to the total loss of significance. So when it's a listed building, then it's the demolition of the listed building. And frankly, I think it would be difficult to see how you could have substantial harm to a conservation area, because how are you going to lose the significance of a conservation area? I think there was some quite large-scale housing proposals recently, a year or two ago, at Wyndham in Norfolk. Does anybody know Wyndham? There's Wyndham. There's a medieval church there called Wyndham Abbey. It's spelt Wymondham, but that's how things go in Norfolk. It's pronounced Wyndham. And somebody wanted to build a very large housing estate nearby. And there were issues about the setting of the listed building, and it was a very important listed building. But I think also the question of the conservation area, that's the sort of scheme that you might start to say substantial harm was involved. But when it's less than substantial harm, which is the majority of cases, then what you have to do is to weigh the harm. First of all, you have to find that there is harm, but you have to weigh the harm against the benefit. And I think, and this is not a universally held opinion, but I think that building new houses is a public benefit. Obviously, it benefits the landowner, because the landowner makes a lot of money about it. And that's one reason why you have to be so meticulous, so extremely careful about dealing with the planning system, because there's so much money at stake that you have lots of very expensive lawyers and consultants looking very closely at the system. And you need to be very conscious about that. Turning then more specifically to listed buildings, there are three sorts of listed buildings. Another good question for examiners, because you ought to rattle those off. And they're grade 1, grade 2 star, or grade 2. And interestingly, they're always written in Latin. So it's grade I and grade II star, or grade II for grade 2. You sometimes see architects writing them in ordinary numbers, but they're not. They're written like that. So that's the third bit of Latin for today. And grade 1 and 2 star together add up to about 6%. I think it's 2% of grade 1 and grade 2 star are grade about 4%. And I don't know why they're not amalgamated, because it would be easier. But it means that most buildings you come across are grade 2, and it means that the grade 2 buildings, first of all, have a huge range of quality, from those that just missed one of the top grades to those that just made it into the list. And also they might be listed for different reasons. The reason they're called listed buildings, you can probably guess, is that they're on a list. And the list is a list of buildings of special architectural or historic interest. And the duality of that is important. It can be either architectural interest or historic interest, or more commonly both. And I think if you're doing an appraisal, then think of both. You quite often find in places like Northampton and in villages in Northampton, you find stone cottages with quite big, what I would call outshots. They're extensions to the house out at the back, contemporary with the original, that have big windows in them, because it comes from the 19th century boot and shoe making industry, where people used to sew, and you need light to sew. You get similarly with hats in other parts of the country. Where sewing is needed, you have a special building form that is of social history interest, as well as architectural interest, perhaps. The example that I use as a historic building is a 19th century house in Hertfordshire in Ayotte St Lawrence, which is the home of George Bernard Shaw, which is frankly architecturally undistinguished. Is anybody a fan of George Bernard Shaw? Nobody at all. Well, in that case, I can say that I'm not myself wholly convinced that his home deserves to be listed, because it's him because I'm not a fan of George Bernard Shaw, but nevertheless, there's this historic interest, and you need to cover both. The other thing you need to be conscious of is this sometimes might not be obvious to your client. You might find, in Suffolk, you might find a bit of interesting plaster that's interesting to you. You might, and similarly, you might find on Chorleywood Common there are not only great crested newts, but there are harebells, which are little blue flowers that are indicative of acid grassland, which is unimproved grassland. And it's very difficult to explain to a client why this particular type of grass is more interesting than all the other grass that's in the fields around. So be conscious of your need to understand the issues and to be able to explain the issues. And the other thing to say is that on listed buildings, you quite often have a case where what's at stake is damage to the historic fabric. So if somebody says, well, we've got this wonderful 16th century timber-framed farmhouse, but these days, of course, everybody's a bit tall. They keep banging their heads on the door. We want to cut through the main beams to make the door bigger. Guess what the answer to that is going to be? Obviously, it's not. On the other hand, be very sure that the so-called historic fabric is in fact historic fabric. And again, in an appeal, again in Camden actually, just near Gooch Street, somebody wanted to extend the living accommodation into the roof space of a house, a terraced house. And the architect had come up with a scheme. The planners and the conservation officer were opposed, and they were opposed, I think, largely on the grounds of loss of the historic fabric. It was an 18th century building. And I had a look in the roof, and when it came to the hearing, I explained what I thought about the roof, and it turned out that the conservation officer had never looked in the roof. And that was a case where we got costs against the council for unreasonable behaviour. And the reason why was that when I looked in the roof, I could see that it was actually 1950s timber. And when I did a bit of research, I found that a flying bomb had landed. You know what a flying bomb is? One of these pilotless bombs that just land at random places. Had landed just a few doors away, which explained, first of all, why there were no houses there. It was a play space. But it also explained why all the houses round had relatively new roofs, by which I mean roofs that were 50 or 60 years old, not 200 years old. So if you're giving evidence, if you're asked to explain about the fabric of the building, then make sure you go and have a careful look. Does that need saying? It's sort of obvious, but you would have thought that a conservation officer would have known that that was obvious and that it ought to have been done. I've already mentioned things that aren't listed. Don't forget that some curtilage buildings are generally listed. Some modern buildings aren't. If you've got a 1970s B&Q greenhouse in the curtilage, then it might not be listed. But you can get into some quite difficult discussions about what the curtilage is. Oh, I'm assuming, does everybody know what a curtilage is? A curtilage, no, because if you put it in Word, it comes up with cartilage. And cartilage is something to do with your knees and skiing, as I understand it. But curtilage means the garden area that goes with a house in a simple case. But when you come to a factory, does it include the workers' cottages that were originally part of the 18th century factory complex? Does it include the barns that are alongside the 16th century farmhouse? Does it include the Victorian tea house that's built a half a mile away from a Grade 1 listed building in Essex that was a 16th century country house? The answer to the last question is yes, it did actually. The curtilage was huge. And it was because it was all part of what was closely associated with the listed building. So buildings in the garden are protected, so that if you have a nice 18th century gazebo in the garden, that's also protected. Years ago, I dealt with a Lutyens house, which was a Grade 1 listed building, and it had a garden by Gertrude Jekyll, and it had a rose garden with a really nice sundial, a stone sundial standing about this high from the ground in the middle of the rose garden. And I was very tempted to put it in the boot of my car, to have my own Lutyens sculpture. And I didn't, knowing, of course, that that would have been a criminal offence, and also because I couldn't lift it. But those things. I have to emphasise that if you do carry out work to a listed building, then the work is a criminal offence. I don't know if I've got that on a slide. Yes. If you carry out work to a listed building, first of all, the work has to be authorised. And secondly, if a person contravenes Section 7, that's the previous one, he shall be guilty of an offence. And just to be quite clear, the fact that it says he shall doesn't mean that the other half of the audience is immune from prosecution, because she shall as well. And I've come across that. We'll deal with that in a little while. In some cases, I've had somebody approach me where work has been done, and we've had to consider what the implications are. It might be that you can apply for listed building consent retrospectively, but that's still a criminal offence. A criminal offence has still been committed, not the same as the case of a planning permission. In some cases, I've been able to argue, and you can see the weasel words. You know what I mean by weasel words, the slightly sneaky, cheeky words, that it's alteration or extension in a manner that would affect its character as a building of special interest. And the case that I offer was in Sussex, and it was a case where I'd been working on or subsequently did work actually, on a listed building which looked from the outside like a country house, because it had been built in the late 18th century, more or less as a country house. But it had been built as what in the 18th century would have been called a lunatic asylum for, the likes of the woman in Jane Eyre, the mad woman in the attic, to be put away. And there had been a lunatic asylum built, I suppose, for the relations of the aristocracy. I think in the 18th century that happened quite a lot in the aristocracy. And over the years, it had always been in the same use. It was now a residential care home dealing with some quite disturbed people. And what had happened was that the management, the original rooms had been quite big, and the management had put in wet rooms, private shower rooms really, for the inhabitants. And they hadn't applied for listed building consent, and they'd, I think, put in 40 wet rooms. And the building control officer had, of course, come up, inspected the final work, gone back to the local authority, and happened to mention, presumably in the canteen to a conservation area, that, they've just finished all that work back up at the big house. And of course, the next thing is that the conservation officer pays a visit and wants to know about listed building consent. In that case, we were able to argue that because the interior had been so changed over the more than 200 years that had gone by, the work that had now been done didn't, and I quote, affect the character as a building of special architectural or historic interest. But if I'd been advising from the beginning, I'd have said I wouldn't try to take that sort of chance. I would, these days, get a certificate to be quite clear that everybody agreed that that's what the situation is. And bear in mind that the listed building protection, and I think I can give you that as well on the screen. Yes, I've given you two quotations from what's often called the Listed Buildings Act, and that's the whole title. And whether you're applying for listed building consent for work to a listed building or planning permission for development that affects a listed building, and I've come across conservation consultants, listed building consultants getting that wrong, but in both cases you have to have regard to the same things. Preserve the building, so you can't demolish the building, or its setting, so you might be affecting something that's some distance away and still affects the setting of a listed building, and sometimes the argument might be that it's a long way away. Or any feature of architectural or historic interest, and you come to arguments about whether the statues on the parapets or the tapestries in the dining room are part of the building, or whether they're fixtures and fittings. You can get into landlord and tenant law about the suspended ceilings and the lights and so on if you're not careful. Do be very cautious about that, and very cautious about the outbuildings and the status. Moving to, oh yes, this is just picking up again the point that in general terms substantial harm is a high test. And just to undo what I told you 5 minutes ago, in the planning practice guidance it says even minor works have the potential to cause substantial harm. And that's where I start tearing my hair out, because I think it's very difficult to really judge when that would apply. But I have come across that applying. But I think it means when some particularly important feature has been changed. Yes?
Could you briefly explain the difference, or what you get away with on grade 2 listed building as opposed to grade 1?
Right, the question is, what can I get away with on a grade 2 listed building? I think that depends on the grade 2 listed building. And I think the answer has to be that you can't get away with anything. And the tendency is always to make the consideration, to make the decision tighter and tighter and tighter. It's what's called a ratchet effect. And now, does everybody know what a ratchet is? I think some do, some don't. You know if you've got your watch and when you're winding up your watch, does everybody wind up their watches? If you've got an old-fashioned watch and you wind it up, there's something that stops the spring from going backwards, and it's called a ratchet. It's a toothed wheel that stops the wheel from going backwards. So in planning, every time somebody makes a decision, they make a decision that's a little tougher than the last decision. And then the next one's a little tougher than that, and so on. And this process has been going on since the 1st of July 1948, which means that now I think it's very difficult to see how things are. There are, as I said, I gave the example of the country house stroke lunatic asylum. I think that was a difficult decision that went our way. I'm not sure that it would always go our way. And I think increasingly, and I'll come to that in a moment when I talk about enforcement, that increasingly you have to make assumptions about getting your paperwork in order just in case somebody takes a harder decision. And every case has to be, there's a standard statement, every case has to be decided on its own merits. There isn't a general rule about what can you do. Oh, on grade one, the way I've heard that explained is that the dust on the rafters in the roof space is protected. Okay? Grade 1 and grade 2 SAR is almost the same. Grade 1 are things like cathedrals and very important country houses and Lutyens' very best buildings. They're museum pieces. And I think that, the decision on a listed building is, first of all, you have to decide whether substantial harm is involved. If substantial harm is involved, which is the demolition of the building, say, then the answer is no. I think I've only in my career once allowed the demolition of a listed building. Very rare indeed. If harm is to be caused, first of all, you have to say, is harm going to be caused? In the case of if listed building consent had been needed on the lunatic asylum, we'd have said, well, no harm will be caused because it's been changed so much, even if technically listed building consent is needed. If harm is to be caused, and it might be said, well, look, we're going to be ripping out some 18th century woodwork. That wasn't the case, but if it had been, you might have said, look, these are very disturbed children. Some of them were under the age of 16, really disturbed, locked in with call handsets and so on. Then being able to shower people or for them to take a shower under supervision in a wet room is so important that it trumps the damage to the listed building. And that's where you start to weigh it. I don't suppose many of you can manage, but up till the 1970s, it was relatively common to come across houses that didn't have a bathroom or an indoor toilet. You had a bath which hung on the wall in the kitchen and was filled with hot water in front of the fireplace, and you had a privy at the bottom of the garden, and not only in farming communities. So if you had a listed building, which you might have with no bathroom, then clearly there's a very powerful incentive. There's a lot of emphasis on bringing standards up to the 20th century. On the other hand, where you've got a really nice house in Islington, whether you need a second billiard room or another computer games room, and therefore you need an extension, is, I think, a much more difficult argument to win. And it's a question of running the argument. I'm afraid I'm going to move on because I'm told that you're allocated some time for eating this evening. The next, just quickly then, conservation areas. There aren't the grades that there used to be. Again, I've already said you have to do appraisals, and there are some, there used to be something called outstanding conservation areas, which was a heritage grant system. And you can see at the centre of Cambridge or the centre of Bath or Long Melford or Clare in Suffolk. So there are some villages, I'm sorry I can't pick one out offhand in Lancashire, but you can pick out some areas that are particularly good, but some areas, I think in places like Bromley and St Albans, you find areas that were designated as conservation areas in order to prevent demolition of buildings and the building of blocks of flats. And so although they're maybe late 19th century or early 20th century housing developments, they're not so, they're not as wonderful as some others. And this is the critical point. This is in the papers. You have to, once you've learned that extract about section 38 bracket 6, remember about the primacy of the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise, this is another thing that you have to memorize, preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of the conservation area. And those four words, preserve, enhance, character and appearance, are really what conservation area decisions turn on. Preserving means leaving the conservation area essentially unharmed. And there was a particular case that is called the Shimizu case because although it was in London, the property developer was a Japanese corporation. And, no, that's wrong. I've jumped ahead. The case I'm referring to is the Steinberg case, which said that you had to either preserve or enhance. The subsequent case was the South Lakelands case that said that preserving was leaving unharmed. But if you're going to leave unharmed, it means as an architect you're not going to make much impact, and therefore what you should really be doing is to be enhancing the conservation area. And that's quite a difficult hurdle to jump. That's quite a difficult fence to jump, but that's what you've got to be aiming at. And then you've got the two questions, character or appearance. And I don't know anywhere that really very precisely spells that out. The way I try to distinguish is that appearance is visual. You see what the appearance of the conservation area is, and character is in some ways more nebulous. It can be to do with what's going on. It's, I know we're a long way north, but has anybody ever been to Leicester Square in London? You probably have. If you go to Leicester Square, and perhaps you can save up for a train ticket, but you see it's very bustling, lots going on, lots of lights and so on. And there was a particular case that was to do with an illuminated sign in Leicester Square, and it was decided that the character of the area actually, an illuminated sign was appropriate, whereas even other parts of London, and certainly villages in Suffolk, an illuminated sign would have been absolutely out of the question. You see what I mean by the character of the area. The other thing that you get is you get parts of, you get in Edinburgh and in parts of Kent and in parts of Cambridgeshire and the Isle of Ely, you get village patterns which have very long, thin plots, because that was a medieval village pattern. And then, of course, people gather together the backland plots and try to create a development of executive housing. And I think that changes the urban pattern, it changes the development pattern. And I think that can be said to change the character of an area. And then coming to, now I can talk about Shimizu. When you're considering planning applications, development in conservation areas, you consider the policies and you consider those principles, but then there are some legal controls. In conservation areas, you're not allowed to demolish an unlisted building. You're not allowed to demolish a listed building because it's listed. You're not allowed to demolish an unlisted building because it's in a conservation area. There used to be something called conservation area consent, which you might hear referred to, but now there's part of the planning process. And similarly, you're not allowed to cut down trees in a conservation area without going through what in effect is a prior notification system. And that's akin, I've said, compare with with tree preservation orders. A tree which is subject to a tree preservation order is protected not only from being cut down, but from harm. So you have to be careful. You're not allowed to go along and cut off branches or dig up the roots. And a tree in a conservation area is in effect protected in the same way. The Shimizu case was about an unlisted building in a conservation area and about how extensive the demolition had to be before you needed, in those days, conservation area consent for demolition. And I'm not sure that Shimizu would be decided in the same way now, because it was decided that you needed conservation area consent only if the building were to be substantially demolished. And Shimizu didn't actually leave very much at all of the original building. The only thing to say is that the ratchet has worked in a different way, because how it now works is that you need planning permission for a material change in the external appearance, and that's something I've had to skip over. That's in section 55 of the Act, which I quoted before, and is in more detail in the schedules, in the notes. but in the references. And now, if you demolish 3/4 of a building, then you've changed the appearance of the building. So you might not need permission for the demolition of the building, but you need permission for changing its appearance anyway. So you're caught both ways. And just really in passing, in terms of conservation areas, you need, and I haven't got to that yet. In terms of conservation areas, you need to know that the rules are much tighter in conservation areas, so permitted development rules, for example, but in some cases, local authorities have gone through a process which has removed permitted development rights, and that can be inside or outside conservation areas, but it's much more common within conservation areas for councils to remove permitted development rights, for example, for the demolition of boundary walls and things like that, that add to the character. So be very careful about what are called Article 4 directions. You might also find on a planning permission that there's restriction on permitted development rights. Yes?
So, question. In a grade 2, in a conservation area with grade 2 listed Victorian houses in West London,
yes.
One house owner determined that the trees growing in the garden of another owner were going to affect and undermine their foundation.
Yes. No.
Was that illegal?
That's a criminal offence and liable to give rise to a fine. Oh, can everybody hear that? Somebody was worried about the roots of a tree in next door's garden, and so they cut down the tree. That's a criminal offence, and also it's a trespass on next door's garden, so it's a civil offence. There'll be a civil claim. What ought to have happened is an application ought to be made to the council to cut down the tree because of the damage or potential damage, and the council ought to have granted tree preservation order consent. And I think they would have. Actually, I think it was a very foolish thing to do in a mixed audience. I'm only allowed to say very foolish thing to do. They shouldn't have done it, and it wasn't necessary to do it. But there it is, people do silly things. I must move to just the last section, I think. I've touched on tree preservation orders, just as a warning. There are 4 sorts of tree preservation orders, either individual trees or groups of trees or areas of trees or woodlands. The interesting thing is woodlands. All the others specify, one way or another, particular trees. And so the first thing to do is to go along and say, is this the tree that I see before me? Because if what's on the schedule is a horse chestnut, and what you see is a sycamore, the horse chestnut has obviously died and a sycamore has grown in its place, or more likely 5 sycamores. I used to think that sycamores couldn't be protected, but I think they can now. I think they do serve us purpose. I used to think of sycamore trees as weeds, just big weeds. But I think now, especially in urban areas, they can, because they're very robust. And by the way, can everybody tell the difference between a horse chestnut and a sycamore and things like that? Because you ought to be able to. I think architects ought to know things like that, at least the main forest trees that are standing. You ought to know if something's an oak tree or a silver birch or something like that. Let me move now quickly to lawful development certificates and enforcement cases. Because I used to skate over the whole section, which was to do with what happened when things went horribly wrong and somebody came along with an enforcement notice to say your new building's got to be knocked down. And that used to happen, and does still happen. Has everybody heard of the man who built a house hidden behind some bales of straw? I think nearly everybody's heard of that. And in the end, he was made to knock it down. We'll come to why in a moment. That used to be hardly an issue for architects, but now I think it is. And the first thing I would raise and this also now answers a question that was raised in the interval by a couple of people, which is that the world is now so complicated that you need to be very sure that you're right about something, and generally speaking, you need a piece of paper, especially if you're working for a developer. A developer is going to do something and then sell on, and all the paperwork, all your paperwork, is going to be crawled over by at least 2 solicitors, one on each side, to make sure that all the necessary permissions are in place. And if they're not, the purchaser is going to say, oh, I think there's a real risk here of the council coming along and saying that it's got to be changed. I want £10,000 off the price just for the risk, and I want another £50,000 off the price in case I have to change the windows or something like that. And what I would say is in lots of cases where I've been talking about prior notifications, lawful development, permitted development is subject to notifying the council what you're going to do, and the council agreeing on very strictly limited terms, on very strictly limited grounds, that what you want to do without permission, you can do without permission. So you have to make a prior notification application. And if you don't, by the way, it means that the permitted development right is lost. You start as though it were never there in the first place. I think it's still a material consideration, but I've come across councils who don't even think that. And so it's very important to get that right. In other cases where there's no strict requirement to notify, it might be a very small extension. It might be something that you thought was de minimis. You remember de minimis, the second bit of Latin I taught you, it's trivial. It's so tiny that it doesn't matter. Just to be on the safe side, unless it really is very obvious, I would be inclined to apply for what's called a lawful development certificate. And it's a formal application on the planning portal, the same as anything else. And the general rule would be that you would apply. You would probably need to put in some drawings, the drawings that you want to say don't need planning permission, and then an explanation of why. And it might be because you think this is a de minimis change, a trivial change from something you've already got planning permission for. You might have wanted to do that by condition, but you might do it that way. You might say that this is something that's permitted development. You might say that while you're, and this happened to the house next door to me, while you're building your house extension with all the planning permissions in place, you actually want to do some work in the gardens that you don't think are engineering works, but somebody might think are engineering works. So you just want a certificate that it's lawful to say that it's not engineering works in the garden. I think to be safe and secure, the architect would apply for a certificate and attach that to whatever else you were doing. In some cases, the lawful development is not based on permitted development rights, but it's based on the history of the site. So that you've built a house. Can you imagine doing this? You build a house, and after 4 years, you can't be made to knock it down. It becomes lawful. And it derives from some actually unrelated law. I think it derived from immigration law. But after 4 years, it becomes lawful under this concept. So provided nobody notices for 4 years, then you're free and clear. Can you imagine nobody noticing for 4 years? It's happened. I've acted for people at least 3 times now where that's what's happened. And the house in the end has been allowed. In one case it's a 2-story house, in another case it's a bungalow, in another case it's a part of a much bigger shed. But you would apply for a lawful development certificate to say that this is why this has become lawful, because of the passage of time. And whatever the evidence is, then it's up to the applicant to prove the case. That might be easy if it's a matter of law and permitted development. In the case of the history, the council, the local planning authority, is entitled to say, we don't think you've proved the case on the balance of probability. And I think the balance of probability is still, the ARB might take a different view, but I think that the balance of probability still means you've got to prove something. It doesn't mean you've got to toss a coin. It's still got to be proved. But the local planning authority can still say, on the balance of probability, this case is not made out, and the certificate of lawfulness is withheld. And the evidence has to be good and preferably independent evidence. And the best way, well, in the case of the houses, one of the houses that was built was, it was built by a farmer, and it was built by, he bought from a school 2 redundant classrooms that were porter cabins. And he parked them on his farm, and he built a little brick, and they weren't on wheels. It's very important they weren't on wheels. He built a little brick link building with a loo in it and a bathroom and a shower room, and that became his house, and they lived in it. And he had a receipt from the school for the porter cabins, but that's not when it was finished. That didn't even show necessarily when it was started, and it has to be 4 years from when it was finished. He had the receipt for the bricks. That doesn't show when it was finished. What he had was he had the Christmas family photographs for when it was finished, and he had 2 small boys, and 4 years later, 2 demonstrably bigger boys, and that was conclusive, and we were granted the lawful development certificate. Where the man with the straw bales went wrong is that after 4 years, he thought, my house has been finished for 4 years, I'm free and clear, took the bales away, and the planning inspector said, but the last operation in the building process was the removal of the straw bales. Isn't that clever? Therefore, and he was found to be right all the way up to the Supreme Court. And that's why the man who built the house behind the straw bales didn't succeed. Now, in another case, and this was a case, and I use this case to illustrate a different point, which is the 10-year rule. Building a house or occupying a building as a house is 4 years. For most purposes, the immunity period is 10 years. And this was a case of a farmer who'd been working for a farmyard. He'd been, I think, sort of renting space in the farmer's yard for a long time, a very long time. And he wanted to apply for, in effect, a lawful development certificate. And I asked him what evidence he had. And I was hoping for tax receipts. I don't think this particular builder did tax receipts. And the farmer didn't do receipts for rent either. So in the end, the only real evidence we had was the evidence of the farmer, a statement by the farmer, a sworn statement, an affidavit, which means he swears. So that's the 4th piece of Latin I've taught you today. An affidavit to the effect that he'd been there for 20 years. And I did say that I thought that the council might well decide that that wasn't enough to prove on the balance of probability, although it was a sworn statement and therefore subject to perjury laws and so on. And we made the application, and there was a storm of protest. And the parish council wrote in very much against this. And they said that the builders' lorries were blocking up the country lane, which they were, and they were leaving mud on the country lane, which they were. And it was time that he was made to stop. And they said he's been doing this now for 20 years and he should be made to stop. And you know what the outcome was, don't you? That was the conclusive evidence that meant that the council had to grant the certificate. And the certificate was granted. What I'm trying to emphasize is the importance of the evidence. And it's not just opinion, it's not just what somebody remembers. If you have independent evidence, that's what deals with the case. And The other thing to say is about listed buildings, that there is now a similar process, although the forms haven't quite been modernised, I think. The last time I tried to apply, I had to do it by letter, but I think there is now a form for a similar sort of certificate applying to a listed building, and that would answer somebody's question about what can you, I hesitate to use the word get away with, but what could you do to a listed building without listed building consent? The answer is you spell out what you want to do and see if you can get a certificate that says you can do it. Now I'm turning to the question of enforcement, and this is sort of the next stage down the track, which is not you, as it were, preempting the scheme. And incidentally, one reason why I would apply for a lawful development certificate is that usually it's easier to obtain a lawful development certificate when it's not contentious. Once somebody has started to write in to say, well, this extension has turned out a bit bigger than we expected, or it's turned out a different colour from what we expected, or something like that, then it's much harder for anybody involved to stand back and take a dispassionate view of whether a certificate should be granted. Then if an enforcement notice is served, then the first thing to say is that you pretty much have to stop doing everything else. And if it's your project, you have to start talking to your insurers. Because whereas the planning appeal process, it's 12 weeks generally for a householder case, 6 months for most cases, and even then, if you miss the deadline, you won't be allowed, although technically you could ask, but you won't in reality be allowed to submit a late appeal. But you make a new planning application, you get a new refusal notice, probably quite quickly, and then you appeal again. If the listed building appeal isn't lodged, then once the notice for appeal has expired, the notice comes into force. There's no further appeal. You can't go back and start again. It means that the building owner has lost the chance to appeal for all practical purposes, and it's difficult to go to the High Court and have an enforcement notice quashed, and much more expensive. And the time allowed would generally be 4 weeks. It might be a calendar month. It might be 5 weeks if the notice was issued on Christmas Eve or something like that. But by and large, the timescale is very short. And also, in my experience, clients come to you having left it a bit late. So when you've been given 4 weeks, they sometimes come to you when 3 weeks have already gone by or something like that. So be very nervous about them. And just in passing, there's something called a stop notice, and that's very rare, but the stop notice tells you that not only are you not allowed to do what you're doing, but you've got to stop doing it. If it's a use of a building, then you've got to stop doing it forthwith. If you're building a building, you've got to stop building it. And I think I've only twice had to deal with those. In one case, it was about building a building. It was an architect's own house, and they issued a stop notice because they didn't like the design of his windows. And it was Kensington, I think, and they lost the appeal, and they had costs of the appeal awarded against them. And because they'd issued a stop notice, they had damages awarded against them. That's very rare, and that's why the notices are not often used, because it becomes very expensive. In the other case, it was a case about a use, and it was an illegal party being run by the grandson of an old friend of mine in Tower Hamlets. And, well, you probably know more about illegal parties than I do. Is that general? Anyway, it was quite rough. And I knew we'd lost when Viscount somebody who worked for a charity opposite turned up at the inquiry to complain about a bullet hole in the window of his office. And there was actually a bullet hole in the window of his office. And the answer is we lost the appeal. I mean, I think it was difficult to win that one. But the stop notice is rare and usually used in extreme cases. The listed building enforcement notices, you have a similar situation, that a notice comes along that says you've done this work to a listed building and you shouldn't have. And the notice, now we get into very strict law. The notice has to tell you what the breach is, has to tell you what the remedy has to be. In other words, you've taken out these wooden windows and replaced them with plastic windows. That's the breach. What you have to do is to take out the plastic windows and put back wooden windows to match the originals. And it has to be quite specific about that. Sometimes you have to refer to the building next door in a terrace where the old windows are still there. It has to tell you how long you've got to comply, and it's often quite short, 6 months, and how long you've got for appeal, and that tells you you've got 4 weeks or 5 weeks or something. It then tells you the grounds of appeal, and the usual ground by a long way is that there's a deemed application for planning permission, or as the case may be, for listed building consent. And in that case, it runs just like a planning appeal. It just says that you've got to apply you've got to appeal for planning permission or for listed building consent, and put in the same sort of arguments that you would have to do on a planning application and then on an appeal or a listed building consent appeal. It's when you get outside that to the technical grounds that it gets more interesting, and you go back to the stuff about the lawful development certificate, which, remember, there might be an argument that you didn't need planning permission or listed building consent in the first place. There might be an argument that you're within the immunity period. There might be an argument that planning permission, for example, is not needed because of permitted development rights. There might be a technical ground. I once had a case where somebody did come to me, and it was for a car park. He built a car park in a field to serve a pub. And he came to me the day before the notice was due to come into effect. And I looked at it carefully, and I found that nobody had signed the notice. And I quickly contacted the chief legal officer of the council, who agreed with me that that meant the notice didn't exist. If the owner of the land hasn't been served with a notice that's been signed by a competent officer, it doesn't exist. In fact, what happened was that the notice then was withdrawn then and there. What, of course, the legal officer said was, well, we'll serve you another one. You'll get it in 2 weeks' time, which is sort of how long it would take to go through the process. In the meantime, we managed to discuss with the planners the practical benefits of this village pub having a car park, because otherwise the cars are all up and down the verges and blocking the country lanes and so on. And we got planning permission, actually. We never did get another enforcement notice. We got a planning permission. But that's unusual. The general argument, as I say, is that you ought to be granted planning permission or consent. And the runner-up, I would say, is either that it's permitted development or that you're free and clear, that it's within the immunity periods. But be very careful with listed buildings, because there are no listed building immunity periods. The only thing you can do is to go back to when the original building was listed, which might be the 1960s. I think in some cases there's a cut-off in 1969, but basically you can go back years and years and years and find that the listed building works still have to be put right. Bear in mind that it's a criminal offence, as I said, to carry out works to a listed building. And I think I should say Yes, let me just do that. Yes, I have done that, haven't I? Yes, the fact that there's no immunity period, but the crime is doing the work. Again, I had a case a few years ago where the architect came to talk to me and take me to see some planners, where his client had bought a building, a house in West London, and wanted to do some works on the lower ground floor level, the garden semi-basement level. And it turned out that the previous owner had carried out work, and the council became very belligerent and said, not only are we not going to allow you to do what you want to do, but we're going to prosecute you. And that was the point that I got involved. And at the meeting, I pointed out, first of all, that they couldn't possibly prosecute the new owners. They might be able to track down the old owners. But while they were about it, that the previous architect had, in fact, obtained building regulations approval for these works. And the building regulations approval the work had been inspected and signed off. And so if they were thinking of prosecuting somebody, the first person to prosecute was the council's own chief building control officer. And they didn't think much of that. But after a bit more discussion, they went away, and I was told later that the architect got a phone call after we all got back to our offices and was told that they'd been thinking about it and they could have another meeting and they would work out what could be done in the basement, and that and they could fire Roger Shrimplin because they weren't going to need any more of those sorts of arguments. So actually they got what they want, and that worked out very well. But the message is that you have to be very careful about doing the work. And I think on this section, this is the sort of the final horror story. And it might have been a listed building, although it wasn't. It was an unlisted building in a conservation area. And the architect had got all the necessary permissions to build lots of extensions and alterations that would have entirely wrapped round the building and completely obliterated anything you could see of it. And the builder convinced the client that the thing to do was simply to demolish the original 1930s house and start again, because you'd finish up with a much better built building, much better thermal insulation and everything else. And of course, as a new building, it was entirely exempt from value-added tax. So it actually saved money on the building project. The architect pointed out that that was a good idea, but would need a new planning application. And neither the client nor the builder wanted to wait to do that. And so the architect was, as it were, bullied into going along with the scheme. To cut a long story short, the council came along and said, we're going to prosecute everybody about this. And the builder was prosecuted, and the builder paid a fine and walked away. The architect was prosecuted, and the architect, in the end, went to court and was very stressed out, although I wrote in support of the architect to the ARB and the RIBA, and he was in court. The judge said it was a technical offence, and the ARB and the RIBA reprimanded him. But it was hugely stressful and hugely expensive. And so, again, the final message is, especially with listed buildings and anything to do with enforcement, be very careful. I should just say, though, that the client who had been pushing the architect wasn't prosecuted, because the client struck a deal with the council to give evidence against the architect. So that, I think, is the message that I ought to leave you with on all this, that don't be very cautious and don't trust everybody. I think just very finally, I've got at the bottom of my last set of crib notes a thing about compulsory purchase and compensation. Do lots of you do master planning I think, or some of you do, not many. I do have a feeling that I come across more and more, and on an international stage, who do master planning, and I think the relationship between compulsory purchase, the local planning authority using its power to acquire land, and the developer using its skills to create a development scheme, might mean that if I'm giving this lecture in another 10 years' time, which seems unlikely, but there'll be more about that. So think about that in the future. Now, I'm told that you'll meet the examiners later on, and that's to prove that they're really human. I'm not sure if that works, but anyway, I think as far as I'm concerned, that's thank you and good night, everybody.